Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Cutter One. I am your host, JJSJ, your resident troublemaker and your resident cultural warrior. I hope you're all doing well. I know it's Monday. It sucks. I know. I feel you. I'm with you. I'm feeling it in me heart and in me soul. I'm feeling the pain that is Monday. But we will get through it and we will push through and we will have another glorious week and make it to another glorious weekend. Right? All right, so let's get right into it. This I am squarely putting into the you don't really know Tolkien category, and you'll understand why. I'll sort of recap after we go through the article. Let's go right into the article. This is coming to us from James Lynch over at CBR.com. CBR.com is going to be our star for today, this week, or I should say today, because every article that I've done so far and that I will be doing today is going to be from them. All right, Middle-earth may fall despite Frodo's efforts in The Lord of the Rings. Frodo's epic quest to destroy the One Ring in The Lord of the Rings saved Middle-earth and its people, but it may have all been in vain. Uh-oh, whatever could James be talking about? By the time Frodo comes into possession of the One Ring towards the end of the Third Age, Middle-earth is at a critical juncture. Even if Bilbo hadn't passed the ring along to his nephew, a resurgent Sauron had discovered its location after capturing and torturing Gollum. Though the Lord of the Rings books and films differ in their portrayal, 17 years pass before Frodo sets off on his quest to Mordor to destroy the One Ring. What follows is a quest mired in danger and one that literally holds the fate of Middle-earth and, possibly by extension, Arda in its hands. Though Frodo is eventually successful in his task, a significant and doom-laden prophecy in Tolkien's universe might mean that the events of The Lord of the Rings only serve as a stay of execution for the Free Peoples. Tolkien's greatest evil will return and wreak havoc. And I want you to notice something that's happening, okay? And I know I'm digressing from the article just for a second here because this just dawned on me, and I want to share it with you guys. Do you notice how now media outlets, when talking about Tolkien specifically related to the books, or the Peter Jackson film specifically related, now they're starting to incorporate rings of pewter imagery, okay, as if it is canonical. It's a canonical part of what they're talking about. So, for instance, he mentioned, despite Sauron being on the rise in the Lord of the Rings, and what are we seeing here is a still from the Rings of Pewter, right? Has nothing to do with the books, has nothing to do with the films, okay? But anyway, it's just a slight little. This is, again, as I always say, this is how the media works. It's slow. It's death by a thousand cuts. Little things that fly under the radar is how they get you. And I just wanted to point this out. Anyway, let's continue. Tolkien's greatest evil will return and wreak havoc. And again, the picture is from Rings of Pewter. The story starts with one of the most notable Valar, a race of demigods in Tolkien's work, The Silmarillion. Below only Eru Ilúvatar, the god of the author's universe, in terms of power. One of these Valar is Mandos, also known as the Doomsman, who announced many judgments relating to the overall fate of the world created by Eru. One of these, the second prophecy of Mandos, predicts the Dagor Dagorath, an apocalyptic battle at the end of all things. The prophecy states that when the world is very old, Morgoth, the original big bad in Tolkien's creation, will return through the Door of Night, through which he was banished, to wreak havoc and terror upon Arda. The Valar will ride out to meet him, and some of the great heroes of the First Age of Middle-earth will return, including Turambar. Turin is the most skilled warrior man has ever produced, and it is he who will strike down the grand foe of the forces of good and, in doing so, finally avenge all of the men who fell in the wars that preceded it. The race of men may not return after the apocalypse. What happens next is, and now you notice the picture is from Peter Jackson's films, right? Just to let you know, right, how they're trying to slowly morph this all into just one Lord of the Rings thing to include Rings of Pewter. Anyway, what happens next is the most critical part of the prophecy. It is said that the world will be broken and remade, while the Silmarils, great jewels created in the First Age, will be rediscovered. The light of the two trees, which was depicted in the Rings of Pewter series on Prime Video, will be restored, and that light will radiate across the world. All elves will return, including those who have died, and a paradise of sorts will be created. The big problem is that the prophecy does not mention a fate for men, whose entire destiny hung in the balance during the events of The Lord of the Rings. In all likelihood, this doesn't bode particularly well for the most flawed and interesting of Tolkien's races. This does mean that however long it may take for the Dagor Dagorath to arrive, Frodo's quest ultimately only delays the overall doom of men. Though it isn't explicitly stated, there is some hope that man will be saved as the world is renewed. Lord of the Rings fans know that at least Turambar. Why do I always think I say that wrong? And then I look at it and I'm like, no, I said it right. Turambar will be granted access to this post-apocalyptic paradise. It could be that the prophecy did not account for men still being around at the time of the Dagor Dagorath. In any case, it is almost certain that many of those around at the time of the beginning of this event will see their lives end following the arrival of the Dark Lord Morgoth. All right, and as I said before, this for me goes exactly into this category. Why does it go into that category? Well, let me explain to you why. Because as most Tolkien fans know about the Red Book, right, and the concept of the Red Book, right, you know that Tolkien's, it's sort of like an ARG. Now, if you know what an ARG is, an alternate reality game, okay, Tolkien to me was one of like the first ARG guys, right? Because what he did was, regarding the Red Book and the Red Book theory, I guess some people call it, right, is Tolkien's original concept, or the concept with the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and that universe, was that it was a sort of mythological, legendary prehistory, right? It was like history before we wrote down history, right? So Middle Earth is actually our Earth, okay? Arda is Earth, okay? And you could even see it. The maps are somewhat similar, right? And overall speaking, if you look at a map of Arda, and you look at a map of the world today that we live in, roughly similar. There's differences, but it's roughly similar. And part of that was because the way Tolkien described it was that the Red Book, which is where all this history came from, that Tolkien just rewrote down. According to him, this was stuff that existed, and the Red Book was found and eventually fell into his possession, and so he was the one translating it and putting it down for modern folks today, right? And so technically everything happening in Lord of the Rings is supposed to be in an era prior to us having a written history, right? And that sort of ties in with his whole wanting to give the British people a sort of mythological past, if you will, right? And that's what he was trying to do. So Middle Earth, technically, if you follow the Red Book theory, it's sort of supposed to be it's part of our timeline. It's not like an alternate universe. It's not like an alternate planet or something like that. It's supposed to be Earth, but prior to written, it's a mythological, something that happened before we started cataloging and documenting history, right? And because of that, you see these little things like this that pop up all the time. And that is with Tolkien's Dagor Dagorath, the prophecy, right? Well, what does that also sound a lot like? Anybody? Bueller? Sounds a lot like the book of Revelations, right? Not specifically. I'm not saying specific things mean specific things, and I'm not trying to do the allegory or applicability thing, right? But what I'm saying is that there's that sort of end times final battle between good and evil where all the chips are in, everything's at stake, right? And ultimately good wins, and then there is a new paradise that's created post the good victory, right? Very much like Revelations, right? Very much like Revelations. And what Tolkien was trying to do there was sort of tie these things in together, right? So in the same way that you see different cultures around the world in throughout history sort of have similar themes. Like for instance, one and this is actual like um archaeological and anthropological fact, right? Throughout our planet, whether it be in the Middle East, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in South America, ancient peoples all have a great flood myth where the world was cleansed and everything started over after a great flood. That is a common theme that no matter what culture or country or continent you go to, there is a people there that have that myth, right? That sort of prehistorical myth, right? It's cross cultural, right? Same thing with certain things like dragons, right? Now, dragons, you can potentially draw a more scientific relation to that one, being, i.e., if ancient people found fossils and they didn't know about fossilization and the process and stuff like that. All they saw was a bunch of bones of a giant fucking lizard, and they just assumed, well, there be dragons here, right? But the concept of dragons, whether it be in ancient historic, prehistory Asia, or in Europe, or and throughout the Middle East and South America with their like demigods like Quetzalcoatl and so on and so forth. You have dragons are another recurring theme, a cross cultural theme, right? It's not just a European thing. It's not just an Asian thing. It shows up all over the world. Same thing with like a flood myth, an ancient flood myth, and I think Tolkien was trying to play with these concepts in to a certain way when trying to build this mythological history for the British people. He wanted it to sort of, and I think that, and I'm making an assumption here, but seeing as how he was a professor of linguistics, he knows the history, a lot of it, of cultures and stuff like that, and myths and legends. I think he was sort of trying to draw that out so that in regards to this red book, if it was like a sort of mythological history for the British people, there would be certain things that would carry over, right? There would be certain things that would carry over to what and may get morphed over time into today what we would call the end times prophecy, right? Or the book of Revelations, or the Nordic peoples have Ragnarok, right? And I'm sure Asian people have their version, some version of it, right? And same thing with Native American people, right? They have their end of worlds. The Mayans and the Aztecs had this whole thing about the different phases, right? That each phase of time, like this circle would come to an end, and everything would be sort of reset, and the world would be reset and started anew, right? And so I think Tolkien was trying to get the Dagor Dagorath to be part of that, right? To fit in with those other sort of end times, prophecies slash myths. And he was doing that because his overall thing was to sort of give this to the British people as a prehistorical mythological history, right? And so that's how that ties in. So why there's no mention of what happens to man in that makes total sense in light of that theory, because Tolkien wouldn't put down what happens to man in that, because it would be part man goes on. It would fit in with our mythological history that we have in our real world, where we have end time prophecies. So it doesn't say what would happen to man, because it over time it gets morphed, it gets changed, and it is sort of like the precursor to our modern end time, revelations or, prophecies and stuff like that. Which, don't mention elves, right? And why is that? Because according to Tolkien and the Red Book theory, elves have faded now and all gone to the undying lands, right? They are not part of our everyday. So our modern version would be based on our modern humanity, which would talk about just us, wouldn't talk about elves. Well, same thing. Dagor Dagorath, because it was meant to be a prehistorical mythological prophecy, if you will, doesn't mention what happens to man, because man's the only one that's going to be around. And Tolkien knows this when he's setting this up, that man is the one that carries these mythologies forward, right? So it's not going to say specifically what happens to us. And in that regards, it makes much more sense. It makes much more sense. That's my take on it. So when I see articles like this where they say, oh, well, Tolkien came up with this end times myth, doesn't even mention men. So what Frodo did in that, and Aragorn was just kind of like a waste of time. They just sort of kicked the can down the road. I'm like, no, because you're not seeing the larger picture of what Tolkien's work was about, right? You're sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater because you're just looking at the movie and thinking that's it, or you're just looking at, the book by itself, and you're not taking into account some of the things that Tolkien said about it and some of his motivations. And when you take into account this sort of Red Book theory and how Tolkien initially toyed with this idea that this was a sort of prehistory that the British people had lost over time, but it had been refound, right? Then these little things where, there's no mention of what happens to man after the Dagor Dagorath make a lot more sense, right? Because we would still be, it hadn't happened yet, because we're here to acknowledge that it hasn't happened yet, right? So I think, and that's why I put this in the you don't know Tolkien category, because it seems to me like the author of this, Mr. James Lynch, is just missing a big part of it, right? But that's just my take on it. So let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. I think this would be a really good conversation thing, topic for a conversation. Let me know. Do you think that's why men aren't mentioned, or I should say the race of men aren't mentioned in the Dagor Dagorath, is because Tolkien had this bigger, wider, I said wider because I know some people will be like, oh, he slipped and said wider, see, because it's racism. No, I said wider. Do you think that Tolkien, had this bigger vision in regards to it, and so that's why he may have specifically left men out of the Dagor Dagorath? Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. All right, folks, that's going to do it for this one. It was an interesting one. I will say that. All right, so just let's keep trucking through Monday, people. Let's just keep on trucking. We'll make it there. We'll make it to the weekend, I promise. All right, folks, that's gonna do it for this one. Remember, if you like the video. If you want to share the video, by all means do so. It would mean the world, because it would help us get seen. It helps us, increase subscribers. It helps us, more importantly, with the YouTube algorithm, because the YouTube algorithm, it's sort of based on what people watch. So the more people that watch this, the more the algorithm puts it out there. And the more it puts it out there, then the more people watch, and so on and so forth. So if you want to share the video around, or to get your friends to check it out and be like, hey, this guy, he's kind of a jerk, but he's funny. By all means do so. Also, if you have not subscribed yet, I would hope that you would consider subscribing and joining the army of beautiful badasses. We're holding the line for Tolkien and his work, and, trying to keep well-written high fantasy alive. That's the goal here. If I had to sum it up, that would be the goal, So I would hope that you would consider turning that red subscribe button gray with your subscription and joining the army of beautiful badasses. As always, if you are a returning subscriber, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. You guys and gals make it all worthwhile. All right, folks, that's going to do it for this one. I will see you on the next one. Remember to be good, be safe, be awesome, but more importantly, stay more dorkish. Peace.